The man glanced at her. The coat, open now from the strong wind that kept blowing, revealed just how thin the child was. For a moment, the man hesitated. His conscience disturbed him slightly. He knew that what he was about to do was wrong, but he had had just enough whiskey that night not to really care. It had been a long time since he'd had a young girl. Bonjour. And welcome to Ralph Reads, brought to you by TURN, the United Ronin Networks. My name is Ralph Anthony Garcia, also known as R4. Please like, share, comment, and subscribe to the United Ronin Networks. We are Ronin. On this edition of Ralph Reads, I will introduce another miniseries inspired by the writings of Donald Goines, entitled Black Girl Lost, a Holloway House classic published in 1973 by Kensington Publishing Corporation. All right, ladies and gentlemen, let the reading commence. Chapter 1. The sounds coming from inside the house were more than just loud and helter-skelter. "You black motherfucker!" The cuss word seemed to fill the night air, whirling around a child who stood shivering in Los Angeles' early March wind. Suddenly, the sound of a bottle breaking came to her. Next, many voices raised at once, until another voice could be heard overriding the rest. The loud confusion that the people inside called partying was an everyday occurrence at the house, as the child well knew. This was not the first time she had come here looking for her mother. More often than not, her mother could be found in the Corn Whiskey House quicker than home. As the early morning wind whipped around and through the young child, she clutched the summer coat she wore more tightly to her. All the buttons were missing, and in places she had pins holding the coat together. But as was the problem with buttons, she didn't own enough pins to do the job properly. Even though she was cold and shivering and her teeth chattered, she still couldn't make up her mind whether or not to go in. She feared her mother's anger to such a degree that she had been standing outside for over an hour in the cold, waiting and hoping that her mother would come out by herself. The house was a small frame building with the dingy gray paint peeling. It sat back from the street, and there was a small concrete pathway that led up to the door. But in most places, the sidewalk was busted. On each side of the sidewalk leading up to the house were hedges, while in front of the house were bushes that stood as high or higher than a man standing straight up. The street light in front of the house was out, so the only light that penetrated the darkness was the little bit that came out from the tightly drawn shades of the house. But the darkness was not what the small child feared. After all, at home on many occasions, their house had been in complete darkness because of an unpaid electric bill. Undecided, she stood there shivering. For the 1,000th time, she almost found the courage to enter the house and ask for a mother. What drove her on was the hunger pains that kept flashing across her stomach. She bent over double as a cramp hit her in the stomach. Tears rolled down her cheeks as she remembered her mother's words early that morning. "Now, don't go out, Sandra. It's too cold out today. I'll bring back something for breakfast in a little while." At times, when her mother hadn't started drinking, Sandra felt an affection for her. But when her mother drank, which was the majority of the time, Sandra shied away from her mother in fear. She had received too many beatings from her mother when she had been drinking, most of the times for nothing. For in her drunken condition, she believed Sandra had disobeyed one of her orders earlier in the day. "Hi there, little sis." The voice coming from out of the darkness made Sandra jump. "What you doing out in all this cold by yourself?" the man asked kindly, but Sandra noticed a slur in it. From past experience, Sandra realized instantly that the man had been drinking. This would have surprised the man speaking to her because he knew he carried his whiskey well. Many grown women wouldn't have been able to recognize that he had taken a drink, let alone that he was loaded. So it didn't even cross his mind that the 9-year-old child in front of him was well aware that he had been drinking. "I'm waiting for my mother," Sandra said slowly, as she began to hope that here was a chance to get her mother out of the corn whiskey joint if she could get the man to go inside and get her out. "Oh, gal, you're wasting your time. Your mother went over to Little Joe's place about 2 hours ago," he said, hoping the child didn't know any better. He didn't even know the child's mother. He had stopped down here on Hooper Street since he was on the east side and decided to pick up a bottle of corn whiskey. He didn't really like the stuff, but he had met a woman who had just come to the West Coast from the South, and the woman swore she loved corn whiskey better than she did bonded whiskey. She wasn't the first person he'd met like that, though. Many people out of the South preferred drinking good corn whiskey to that which you could buy in the stores. Sandra moaned and leaned over in pain. She couldn't stop the tears. She didn't even know where Little Joel's place was, nor did she have any reason to doubt the man's words. "What you crying for?" he inquired softly as he glanced around, hoping that the child's mother didn't come out the front door. "Mama was supposed to give me some money so that I could get something to eat," she answered honestly, hoping that the kind man would offer her a quarter or something near that sum. "Come along, child," he said, taking her firmly by the arm and leading her down the walkway. "I'll drive you around to Little Joe's place, then you can get your mother. How does that sound?" It didn't sound too good at all to Sandra. Her mother would be furious at her for riding in a man's car, especially a man she didn't know. She glanced up at the man. All men or women older than 15 were elderly to her. She tried, but she couldn't remember when or where she had seen him before. Her mother had so many men friends that it was hard to remember them all. Even her mother was hard pushed to remember every last one of them. This one was tall, dark-complexioned, with a heavy mustache. His eyes, under deep black brows, were pools of shimmering black ivory, now filled with a cunning lust. As the young girl hesitated, he added, "If your mother's not there, I'll stop and buy you a hamburger or something, okay?" As the cold wind blasted her thin coat open, she pulled her arm free to clutch the coat tightly. Hunger overcame reason, and she somehow found the nerve to say, "I wish you would get me the hamburger first. I ain't ate since this morning." This was true. The man glanced at her. The coat, open now from the strong wind that kept blowing, revealed just how thin the child was. For a moment, the man hesitated. His conscience disturbed him slightly. He knew that what he was about to do was wrong, but he had had just enough whiskey that night not to really care. It had been a long time since he'd had a young girl. He reached out and got another grip on her arm. He almost dragged her to the car. He opened the passenger side first and put her in, then almost ran around the car. He got in and started the motor. The warmth from the heater quickly filled the car. Sandra sat back and relaxed. After being out in the cold so long, the heat felt good. She closed her eyes and enjoyed the warmth. The thin coat opened since she didn't have to clutch it around her, and she put her hands in her lap. Her eyes closed, but she managed to fight off the sleep. "You're a son of a bitch," the man said to himself as he observed the young kid next to him. With her coat open, he could see just how poor she was. Her legs were so thin that she seemed deformed. The coat with no buttons on it couldn't possibly keep the child warm, he reasoned. What kind of mother could the child have, he wondered, as he took his time and examined her. The mini dress she wore was too small, besides being a spring dress. He reached over and felt the material. The dress was stiff from being out in the cold. He pulled her across the seat and put his arm around her. She was so drowsy that she snuggled up against him. He put his arm around the child and held her protectively. As he touched her bare arm, he could feel how cold she was. Her teeth had begun to chatter uncontrollably, but as he held her tightly, she relaxed. He started the car up and pulled away from the curb. He removed his arm from around her and dropped it down on her leg, only to remove it with shame. Her leg was so small that he could almost put his hand around her thigh. Basically, he was a decent sort of man. He was about to commit an act that he had never done before. He was also in the habit of talking to himself whenever he was alone. Now, with the child dozing beside him, he had time to think about what he was about to do. He decided to stop and get her something to eat first. She never woke up as he parked in front of an all-night restaurant. He left the motor running so that she will be warm, ran into the restaurant, and ordered a chicken dinner with mashed potatoes and navy beans. Then he ordered her a slice of apple pie with a small container of milk. He pulled away from the restaurant and drove until he found a dark side street. He parked on it and woke her up. "Here, Sandra," he said as he shook her awake. He waited until she wiped the sleep out of her eyes and then put the dinner in her lap. She blinked as she came awake. She could feel the hot dinner on her lap, but she couldn't believe it. For a brief moment, Sandra thought that she was dreaming. She glanced up at the strange man, then back at the dinner on her lap. She opened it slowly, and as she stared at the food, her stomach growled loudly, and tears ran down her cheek. Saliva ran out of the side of her mouth as she reached for the first piece of meat. The man, watching her out of the corner of his eye, began to really feel self-conscious as he realized that the child was really hungry. He wondered idly how long it had been since the kid had had a good meal. Had he asked, Sandra could have told him that it had been over 5 days since she'd had any kind of food similar to the dinner in her lap. She had hot dogs to eat, and her mother had made her a jelly sandwich for 2 days past, but nothing like what she held in her lap. Her stomach growled again as she lit into the food. She didn't waste time with a fork or spoon. She picked up a handful of mashed potatoes and crammed them down her throat. She ate like an animal. The man had to look away, not in disgust, but in pity. As he watched the child, he realized he could never go through with what he had planned. There was no way now for him to take advantage of the child. He felt too much pity for her. She seemed to have caught too much hell already in life for him to come along and force himself on her. As he uncorked his whiskey bottle and took a long swig, he thought, how the hell could I ever have even thought about doing something to this child? He cursed at himself, and then the idea of some man attempting to take advantage of one of his daughters flashed across his mind. He had 3 of them, but they were all damn near grown now. He pictured them as they were when they were Sandra's age. Then the thought of a man attempting to do one of them what he had started to do with Sandra filled him with rage. The shame overcame him, and he couldn't think of enough things to do for the child. At first, he toyed with the idea of taking her home, but in a minute, he rejected that idea. It would never work, and besides, he'd be getting in trouble with the police if the child's mother complained about her missing. Next, he wished that he could meet Sandra's mother. He'd tell the sorry bitch a few things. As she finished with the dinner and licked her fingers, he removed the pie from the bag and gave it to her. She looked up at him with wonderment. Her big eyes seemed to swim with gratitude as she tried to smile at him. "How old are you, child?" he asked as he took another swig from the half-empty bottle. "8, she replied, around a mouthful of pie. She ate the pie quickly, as if she was afraid someone would take it away from her. He gave her the milk and watched as she gulped it down. The man took another swig from the bottle, then dropped his hand down on her leg. He slowly ran it up her small thigh, feeling the heat that had now replaced the cold. He put his arm around her again and pulled her closer, and she tried to clean up the mess she had made while eating. They sat in the car quietly, Sandra enjoying the heat while the man allowed himself the small pleasure of rubbing the young girl's leg. His hand moved higher under the thin dress. She opened her eyes and glanced up at him. She had no fear of him since he had been so kind to her. It was so seldom that she came in contact with kindness that she didn't believe he would hurt her. From past experience, she knew that the man was feeling on her. Many times in the past, ever since she could remember, one of her mother's friends had put his hands on her in this fashion, always after they drank too much. One of the men would try and feel her whenever her mother wasn't paying attention. She had never been hurt by it, so in her child's mind, she didn't have any reason to fear it, nor did she dislike it, because attention was something she very seldom got. She could recall times when she had gone out of her way to sit on the lap of a man who she knew liked to rub on her. When he finished, he'd slip her a dime or nickel, depending on what kind of change he had in his pocket. Again, this man in the car found himself in the clutches of the strong drink. His hand began to ramble higher and higher under the child's dress. He fought with his desires, but since she wasn't putting up any resistance, he continued to roam. As Sandra felt his hand pushing the small panties aside, panic gripped her. Fear of the unknown overcame her, and she blurted out, "Please, mister, please, don't hurt me." Her words had a sobering effect on him, and he snatched his hand from under her dress. As she stared up at him, he looked away, too ashamed to look at her. "I'll take you home," he murmured, so low that she hardly heard him. As he started up the motor, shame was a growing thing inside him. Years later in life, whenever he remembered this night, shame would overcome him. He realized as he drove through the silent streets of L.A. that he had almost committed a crime that would have filled him with so much guilt and shame that he seriously doubted if he'd have been able to live with himself. Chapter 2. The chilling winter mornings were just about gone as Sandra stood on the corner of 48th Street and Hoover. But she still had one problem, her daily search for food. She was constantly hungry, but seldom did she get enough to really fill her up. As she stopped in front of Sammy's liquor store, the hunger pains almost caused her to double up. Suddenly, there was a knock on the window, and the sharp noise brought her out of her daydream of food. A table full of all kinds of food was what she always dreamed about. She glanced up and saw Sammy, the owner of the store, smiling kindly at her from inside. He motioned for the young girl to enter, and Sandra noticed as she came through, the store was empty. She grinned up at Sammy, and he smiled in return. "You want to sweep up today?" he asked in that funny way of his. Without replying, she ran into the back of the store and got the broom out. She knew where everything was kept. When she came back to the front of the store, Sammy was busy waiting on the customer. She began sweeping, and it didn't take long before she was finished with the light work he had asked her to do. When she came back from putting the broom up, Sammy asked, "How come you no go to school today?" His smile was broad on his wrinkled face, and his snow-white hair was still thick and bushy. Sandra just shrugged her shoulders. She didn't want to tell the kind old man that she had been too hungry when she got up to think of school. After looking in the refrigerator and finding it empty as always, she had known that she couldn't sit in the classroom all day, not without lunch money. She didn't have to answer Sammy, though. He could tell from what she selected as pay for sweeping up what her problem was. He had known that the child was hungry as she stood outside the store. He had seen the look on too many faces when he was in a concentration camp in Germany. The look of hunger was the same no matter where you were at. He felt sorry for the child, but there was nothing he could really do but help her out like he did whenever she came by. She was really too young for him to hire, so he gave her food whenever she came by. It wasn't necessary for her to sweep up for him, but she seemed to want to feel that she was earning her way. He watched her pick up a pack of cheap lunch meat, then some crackers. "Here," Sammy said as he walked over and got her a pop out of the box. Next, he picked up a cake and gave that to her too. Sandra's eyes were shining as she left the store, clutching the food tightly to her thin chest. She almost ran all the way home. Sammy watched her leave with pity in his kind eyes. It was a shame he knew the child's mother, a drunk who didn't care about anything but where her next drink was coming from. She had been in his store early that morning, buying her daily bottle of whiskey. He gritted his teeth and went back behind the counter. When Sandra arrived home, she hesitated briefly. She didn't want to run into her mother now. She listened outside the door for a minute, making sure there was no sounds from inside, then turned the knob and went in. The house was deserted, just as she'd hoped it would be. She carried her tightly clutched bundle into the kitchen and sat down. There was no bread, so she made small sandwiches with the crackers. She opened her pop. It was a treat. What with the cake and all. Sometimes, when Sammy was busy with customers, she'd go in and steal a can of sardines or something else small. Then her conscience would bother her, because Sammy was so good to her. She really hated to take anything from him without his knowing it. The sound of a key being put in the door caused her to jam the rest of the tiny sandwiches into her mouth. By the time her mother staggered into the kitchen, she had eaten up everything but the cake. Her mother, a thin, brown-complexioned woman, swayed on her feet, then rocked back in her high-heel shoes. Her eyes were bloodshot, while the dress she wore was dirty. One of her stockings was rolled down halfway on her leg, while the other one was put on right. At one time, her mother could have been called slightly attractive. She had a small nose, and her hair was dark brown, but from the constant use of alcohol, her looks were deteriorating. And now, a silence filled the small room. A waiting silence that stifled the air, heightened the glare of the ceiling light, moved the walls inward, sealing them in. "Well now, Miss Lady, why aren't you in school?" her mother asked with sarcasm. For a minute, Sandra started to lie, then decided on the truth. "I was hungry. When I got up here, wasn't nothing to eat, so since I didn't have lunch money, I didn't go." Just for a minute, her mother was quiet, taken aback by the answer. Then she put her hands on her hips. "You kids nowadays are full of shit," she yelled loudly. "When I was your age, we went hungry at times, but we took our asses to school. You didn't have lunch money? What the fuck do you think I am, a money tree? Hell, you ain't no little spoiled white kid. Lunch money my ass." She reached down and snatched up the cake. "You had enough money to buy this shit with. I know you, you little bitch. You been going through my pocketbook, taking my change. That's what you been doing." She started to eat the cake as she rocked back on her heels. "I ain't took nothing from you," Sandra screamed as she jumped up and made a grab for the cake. "Give me back my cake," she yelled loudly as her mother continued to crammed the cake down her throat. "I'll give you hell and call it cake," her mother retorted as she pushed the screaming child away. As her mother made a motion towards the bottle of pop, Sandra leapt in front of her and snatched the pop out of her reach. She ran around the table, attempting to drain the bottle dry. "You better not drink all that pop, you little bitch," her mother ordered sharply. Sandra continued to drain the bottle until it was empty, ignoring the order. She managed to keep the table between them as her mother continued trying to reach her. A loud knock on the door interrupted the fight before it could get worse. A loud man's voice could be heard. "Sandy, open the goddamn door!" a man ordered. Though both women had the same name, most people called Sandra's mother Sandy instead of Sandra. As she staggered towards the door, she made Sandra a promise. "I ain't forgetting, little whore," she swore over her shoulder. Sandra wasn't worried about the threat. She knew her mother would either forget or be in a completely different mood by the time they met again. She watched as her mother opened the door and let the man in. He was carrying a bottle of whiskey. Sandy didn't even stop in the living room. They continued straight on to the bedroom. Then her mother came back out and got 2 glasses, ignoring her daughter completely as if she was just another piece of kitchen furniture. Sandra sat in the kitchen, not really knowing what to do. Now that she was full, she silently wished that she was in school. But then she remembered the way the kids talk about her clothes and decided that she didn't want to be in school. If she never went back to school, she'd be happy. The school children had started to call her Raggedy Ann, a nickname she would rather have done without. The sounds of the bed springs brought her back to reality. She knew then that she'd have to leave the house. She couldn't stand to hear the sounds her mother made when she was drunk and in that bedroom. Sandra quickly got up and left the tiny apartment, slamming the door behind her. She walked from Broadway down to 51st Street, all the way to Western, and then back. She stopped in a small store that was crowded and stole a small cherry pie. She went back out and down the street eating the pie. Later in the day, she went into a supermarket and stole 2 packs of cold lunch meat. She took this so that she'd have something to eat when she got up in the morning. She ate 1 package of the meat and saved the other one. What she wanted most, though, were some cloves, but she didn't know how to steal them. She knew that that would be the only way she'd ever get some. If she had some nice skirts, she'd be able to go to school without the kids getting down on her. The more she thought about it, the more she wanted the clothes. She remembered that there was a shopping center up on Slauson Avenue, so she slowly started walking in that direction. It didn't disturb her that it was over 20 blocks away. The thought of catching a bus was out of the question. It was something only the rich did, she believed. At 10 years of age, she couldn't remember ever being on a bus. Her mother never had any reason to take her anywhere. She noticed older girls putting their thumbs out and getting rides, but that possibly didn't cross her mind. She believed she was too young and nobody would pick her up. Even though she was tall for her age, her chest was as flat as a boy's, and with the clothes she had wore, she didn't appear too attractive. She would have had trouble trying to get a ride. She looked too much like a boy. An hour later, she reached the department store parking lot. She went into the back door of the large store. When she reached the children's department, it was crowded. She picked up an empty bag and walked around until she found the skirts and blouses. She didn't know what size she wore, so she held the skirts up in front of her. When she found what she thought would fit, she selected 4 of them and put them in her shopping bag. 2 black women shopping noticed the child stealing and laughed, but it frightened Sandra so that she only managed to stuff 2 blouses into the bag. She almost dropped the bag and ran, but she wanted the clothes too bad. The saleswomen in the department had noticed the child. Sandra walked back out the way she had come in, swinging her bag happily. Now she could go to school without any trouble. If she had enough money for lunch every day, she wouldn't have any problem, she reasoned, as she made her way out of the store. Chapter 3. By the time Sandra reached the age of 13, she had solved her lunch money problem. She knew how to steal now. She had been caught 5 times in the past 3 years, but it didn't disturb her once she knew what would happen. Most of the time, they turned her loose in the store after talking to her. Only one time they had taken her down to juvenile, and since they'd had so much trouble trying to reach her mother, the policewomen had just given up and sent her home. It wouldn't have made any difference whether or not they'd given her car fare, because she now knew how to stick her finger out to get a ride. With the short skirts she wore, no man would mistake her for a boy now, even though she wore her hair in the short natural. When a stranger met Sandra, he or she was not overwhelmed by any sign of intellectual maturity. But on the other hand, she was a product of circumstances which had been hard and were still hard. She still skipped school whenever she felt like it, not because of lunch money or hunger. Now it was because she wanted the time to go downtown and hustle the stores. Inside of her, there was a driving desire to accumulate a large bankroll. She had a morbid fear of being completely broke. She hoarded money as if it might disappear. She would never allow herself to spend her last dollar. She always kept at least $2 or $3 hidden under her mattress at home. It was abnormal for a child of that age to be so concerned with money. But if she hadn't taken an interest in her own money affairs, she would have starved to death because her mother just didn't care. Or if she cared, she didn't stay sober long enough to follow up on her good intentions. Sandra jumped out of the car on Western and waved merrily at the young brother who had given her the lift all the way from Hollywood and Vine to 38th Street and Western. She clutched a bag to her. Inside was the short leather coat a young prostitute had been worrying her to get. The price tag was $65, so she figured on making at least $30 off the white coat. As she attempted to cross the street, a Cadillac came tearing around the corner. As she jumped back out of the way, the rider on the passenger side tossed a package out of the window. As she watched the package roll under a parked car, she almost got run over by a police car that came roaring around the corner behind the Cadillac. Dope! Dope! The word exploded in her head as she rushed over and reached under the car for the package. Some of the onlookers were watching her curiously as she straightened back up, but she didn't care. She had what she wanted, even though she didn't really know what was in the small brown package. She rushed down the street, wanting to get away before the men in the Cadillac came back and tried to redeem their package. The little white skirt she wore flapped up high against her butt, but she took long steps, putting as much distance between her and that corner as she could. She stopped on 41st Street and delivered the leather coat. "Honey, I ain't got but $25 in the house," the young blonde prostitute stated, slowly fingering the soft leather. If it hadn't been for the package that was burning in her pocket, Sandra would have never left the jacket. But now, all she wanted to do was get home and see what she had. "Okay, I'll let it go for that this time, but don't do that no more. If you state a price, I look for you to pay it if I get the piece you want," Sandra warned the girl coldly. As Sandra let herself out of the woman's apartment, she overheard the girl say to her pimp, who had been watching the transaction, "That's gonna be one cold-hearted bitch when she gets older." "She'd be a bad bitch for somebody if she wasn't so damn young," the pimp replied loudly. "Give her a couple more years, then I might shoot at her myself." When Sandra reached the street, she took the back way. She hurried down to Van Ness and started walking. A young brother drove past slowly. His car broke down in the back, showing that he was a low rider. He gave her the eye, and she stuck out her hand. He quickly slammed on his brakes and waited for her. She ran out to the car and jumped in. As soon as he got a close look at her, he cursed. "Shit, I thought you were older, baby. You ain't hardly over 12, are you? I'm 16, she lied quickly. But if you don't want to give me the lift, that's up to you. She didn't make any attempt to get out, though. He grinned. 16, my ass. If you're a day over 14, I'll give you some cap. She didn't understand what he meant, but she replied, look, man, if you want, I'll pay you for the ride. How about that? You got some cash, honey? He asked quickly. Then he pulled into the gas station. How much gas should I get? He asked and grinned. Sandra removed a $5 bill. How about $2 worth? She inquired. She wasn't frightened of him. She was used to dealing with young men. He didn't seem to be over 18. She stared at him with large eyes. She had the same eyes her mother had. Large bedroom eyes. He looked away. Sure, baby, $2 will be fine. He started to say something else, but the arrival of the gas station attendant interrupted him. Would you stop and let me pick up the Temptations' latest album at the record shop? She asked lightly, not really caring if he stopped or not. He hesitated briefly, then introduced himself. Most of my friends call me Fast Eddie, honey. What do they call you? Sandra, she replied, not bothering to offer any other information. Well, Sandy, he began, but she interrupted sharply. I ain't no Sandy, mister. It's Sandra. Her voice was sharp. Eddie glanced at her quickly. Damn, baby, I do believe you are 16. Ain't no kid gonna speak to no man in that tone of voice. In fact, he added, when I use that tone, I'm either speaking to my dog or to somebody I don't like. I'm sorry, she stated, then continued, I just don't like for anyone to call me Sandy. That's my mother's name, and I don't want you to use her name no way, no kind of way, if you know what I mean. All right, Eddie said easily. It don't make me no kind of difference one way or the other. What I'm interested in is what you gonna give me for taking you to the record shop, then taking you home. How about if you just keep the change from the $5 bill? Would that be all right? Eddie shrugged his wide shoulders. That's cool with me, he stated as he mentally counted the money he had in his pocket. He realized quickly that he'd still be $3 short on his fixed money. Well, he reasoned, $3 was easier to hustle up than the whole $10 that he needed every day. After Sandra picked up her record, Eddie dropped her off at the dilapidated tenant building that she stayed in. He glanced at the building and commented, your landlord must have something against paint, huh? She hadn't understood what he meant, and as she turned and stared up at him, he just shrugged his shoulders as he realized that she hadn't understood. That's okay, baby, he said lightly. If it doesn't bother you, it sure ain't no sweat off my nuts. Again, she didn't understand him. At school, the teachers thought she was a truculent child in some instances, and in others, they just believed she was a half-wit. But in both cases, they were wrong. What Sandra did in school was all for a reason. Ever since she had been sent to school in clothes that made the other kids laugh, she had started to pretend that she was retarded so that she wouldn't be called on and made to stand in front of the whole class. What she had started continued to follow her as she went through school. The teachers expected it from her, so they didn't disturb her. Some of them even believed she couldn't read, while many of her classmates knew that she skipped school sometimes so that she could go sit in the public library and read all day. What the teachers didn't realize was the fact that she had been so ashamed of the other kids' comments that she had developed a protective schizophrenia to meet the problem. When called on by a teacher to stand up and speak, she spoke in a low voice and ran her words together so that no one could really understand what she was saying. It became so exasperating that the teacher would stop calling on her. But now, as she sat in the car in front of her house listening to Eddie and not understanding what he meant, she wondered if she was really dumb. She was not pretending illiteracy now. She just couldn't understand what he meant. Okay, baby, he said as she opened the car door. I'll be seeing you around. As soon as she got out, he pulled off, not realizing that he had left a mixed-up child behind. But what she couldn't understand was his cold remark about the building she stayed in. She didn't have any standards to go by. Every place she had ever lived in had been run down. She didn't understand anything about a ghetto because she had never lived in anything but a ghetto. Her world was small, and being an only child, she had no one to talk to. She lived in her books, the ones she stole from the library. They were her real world. When Sandra reached her apartment, she could hear the noise coming from inside. Her mother was entertaining again. For a second, she wasn't going to go in, but then she remembered the package she had picked up. She opened the door and entered. Couples danced together closely as the record player blasted out the latest hit. Sandy spotted her daughter as soon as she entered. Noticing the album she carried, Sandy rushed over. "What's that you're carrying?" she asked loudly. Sandra passed over the new album and continued on into her bedroom. She didn't feel like arguing with her mother today. In a minute, the sound of the new album filled the apartment. Sandra sat on the bed and opened the package. A number of small balloons rolled out. Each one contained something. Now she knew it was dope. She counted the balloons. There were 20 of them. She didn't even bother to open one. She had seen the boys at school open one up and snort the white stuff that was inside the balloon. She carried the package to her closet and hid it way in the back where she knew her mother would never find it. Then she quickly forgot about it. There was too much noise coming from the group of adults, so she changed clothes quickly and left. Her mother didn't bother to inquire as to where she was going because she really didn't care. Sandy knew that her daughter was stealing, even though Sandra had never told her that she was. But from the clothes she brought home, the mother knew. But as long as her daughter continued to bring her dress home now and then, it didn't make any difference. If she ended up in reform school, it was her own problem, not Sandy's. That was the way her mother looked at it. After Sandra left the house, she walked around aimlessly until she found herself in front of Sammy's store. He grinned at her as she came in and bought a pop and cake. "Hey, Sandra," he said on the spur of the moment. "How'd you like a job in the store in the evenings after school?" He was surprised at his own question. One moment, he was thinking that she was growing up, looking nice in her neat little skirt, and the next moment, he was offering her a job. "Sure, Sammy," she replied quickly. "I like that fine." Frequently, things happen in life that will change the future of a person. This was to be a big step in Sandra's life, one she would always remember. In the following weeks, Sandra would show up at the store with her school books in her arms. Sammy's wife would sometimes be in the store, and on those days, she would take Sandra in the back of the store, and both of them would study Sandra's English book. Sammy's wife was from the old country and wanted to speak English, so Sandra helped her. But in helping, she helped herself. In a matter of a month, there was an astonishing change that took place in Sandra. Even her teachers couldn't believe it. In fact, they didn't want to believe what they had been so sure was a half-witted child was actually one with an agile mind. One reason for the abrupt change was that Sandra didn't have anything to be ashamed of anymore. Her clothes were as good or better now than most of the girls in the class, so she wasn't ashamed to stand up in front of the class and recite. Only now, instead of saying if and eatin or shom, she spoke perfect English, clear, bright, and articulate was Sandra's speech. But it shouldn't have surprised anyone because she was a voracious reader. Actually, the only one surprised were her school teachers because her schoolmates had known all along that Sandra was anything but dumb. On Friday, when Sandra showed up for work, Sammy came quickly from behind the counter. "Come, I want to show you something," he said, and led her from the store, leaving his wife in charge. He took her to the nearest bank and showed her how to open an account. Since it was payday for her, he put $5 in her account. When Sandra left the bank, her eyes were bright. She had found a new experience in life, something that would always keep the fear of hunger at bay. As long as she had money in the bank, she'd never have to worry, she reasoned. As they left the bank, Sammy glanced down at her and grinned. He knew her mother was starting to take most of her paycheck, so he decided to show her how to put the money where her own mother couldn't reach it. He didn't realize just how much of a problem he had solved for Sandra. The summer went by smoothly for Sandra. She had stopped stealing because there was no reason for it now. She had all the money she needed, and her clothes were more than adequate for her needs. With an abundance of food, she had started to fill out, all except her breasts, which were going to be small anyway. She ate constantly, always nibbling on something, until Sammy had commented, "One day, Sandra, if you continue to eat like that, you're going to weigh over 300 pounds. She laughed and continued to eat. Eddie had stopped in the store one day for some wine and found her there alone. Sammy was in the back of the store. Well, if it ain't young blood, what's happening, sweet thing? I know you ain't forgot me." "No, I ain't forget you," she replied softly. "Good," he replied, then walked out of the store without paying her for the bottle of wine or cigarettes she had given him across the counter. Sandra didn't say anything. She walked over and got her purse and counted the money out for the wine and cigarettes. Sammy had watched the whole thing from the lookout slot in the back of the store. He watched as she counted out the change from her purse and put it in the register. He smiled softly, and impatiently he brushed back a tear that appeared in the corner of his eye. He loved honesty. It was a quality in a person that always won him over. He come out from the back of the store. "You know, Sandra, I've been thinking. You worked for us quite a while now. Maybe it's time we gave you a little raise. Maybe $10 more a week, okay?" Sandra glanced up into his kind face. She was so glad that he hadn't seen what had just happened. She didn't know how she could have explained Eddie taking the stuff without paying for it. Sammy was so kind at times. When she thought about how it would have been to have a father, she wished that he would have been like Sammy. While working in the store, she was never aware of a racial problem until one of her mother's drunk friends came in and called Sammy a name. When she blushed in shame, Sammy looked at her and laughed it off. What they said didn't disturb him, he said, because a drunk rarely knew what he was saying anyway. But she was mad the rest of the day. Only when Eddie came in the store was Sammy different. He watched Eddie closely. Sometimes Eddie would pick her up after work. "What's with that honky?" Eddie would ask. "He acts like he's your father or something." "Don't call him no honky," she replied hotly. "I mean it, Eddie. He's got a name, and it sure ain't honky." Okay, baby. Still gonna loan me the $8? He inquired. He'd blown his loan one night by referring to Sammy as a peckerwood. Sandra had got hot and jumped out of the car. Now he knew that if he wanted his blow money, it was best not to talk about the old white dude. Sandra was a strange young girl. At times, she didn't act like a young girl. He knew she liked his company, but when he tried to get close to her, she froze up. He could kiss her, but that was as far as it went. He was beginning to believe she was really a virgin. "What you wantin' with the money, Eddie? I really want to know what you're doing with it. You don't drink that much wine, so it must be stuff, huh?" she asked sharply. Eddie glanced up quickly. At first, he was furious with her for asking, but then he decided that he didn't give a damn anyway. He only got about $10 a week out of her, so he didn't have that much to lose. "Yeah, baby, I want to buy me a fix," he stated harshly, not caring one way or the other what she thought about it. On the other hand, Sandra didn't care either. She had wanted to save the $8 he'd asked for so that she could put it in the bank on Monday. She gave a sigh of relief. "What if that's all you want? I got a balloon at home I found. You can have that, and I'll save my $8. "Shit!" Eddie exclaimed loudly. "You probably ain't found nothing but some damn bunk. I want some dope, girl. I don't want no bullshit." "It ain't bunk. It's dope," she replied coldly. "If it was junk, I'd have thrown it away a long time ago." "How you know what it is? You don't use," Eddie continued the argument. "Well, if you don't want it, it's up to you," she answered coldly. "But I bet it's more in the balloon I'm gonna give you than in the one you was gonna go buy." Eddie didn't even answer. He just turned and started driving in the direction of her home. When they reached her apartment building, he asked, "Can I come up and fix there? I got my outfit with me." Sandra hesitated briefly. Well, I guess it's all right if my mother ain't home. She wasn't worried about her mother catching Eddie fixing. She was worried about the hell she knew her mother would raise when she found Eddie in the apartment. Sandra had never taken a boy to their place, so she knew her mother would have something to say. Since it was payday, she didn't have to worry, though. A few dollars would smooth over her mother's hurt feelings. Eddie got out of the car and followed her into the old apartment building. The stairs they went up were run down and needed repair. He stood back as she stopped in front of the apartment and listened. Then she opened the door. The inside wasn't any different than any of the other crummy apartments he had been inside. "Have a seat," Sandra said after they entered, and she went on into a bedroom. In a second, she was back, carrying a red balloon in her hand. Eddie's eyes got big as he saw the size of the balloon. "It must be at least a spoon," he said to himself as he stared at the object in her hand. She tossed it to him. He caught it and felt how full it was. With his teeth, he bit it open and the dope fell out. Sandra gave him a piece of newspaper to hold under the bag. The stuff tasted bitter and dark. Then he slowly removed his outfit from his pocket. "You better take it in the bathroom in case my mother comes in," Sandra cautioned. Yeah, I know what you mean," he said, not really knowing, too concerned with the dope in his hand. Sandra followed him into the toilet. She stood back, leaning against the wall, and watched him shake out a small amount from the balloon into his cooker. He removed matches from his pocket and struck 3 of them and held them under his cooker. The dope inside the empty wine top dissolved quickly. He set the cooker down on top of the toilet seat and removed his belt. He twisted it around his arm, slowly squeezing his fist until he found a vein that suited his need. Sandra watched closely. It was the first time she had ever seen anyone really cook up some dope, though she had heard about it often enough. She watched, fascinated, as he drew up the drug into the needle, then stuck it into his arm. He got a hit quickly. Blood rushed back into the bulb as he slowly removed the tie from around his arm, then shot the dope. Before he could take the needle out of his arm, his eyes closed and his head dropped down on his chest. Instantly, Sandra became frightened. Eddie, you got to wake up," she yelled. When that didn't do any good, she reached over and pinched his arm until he lifted his head. His eyes rolled back in his head until she could only see the whites of them. "Oh my God," she moaned, then started to slap his face the way she did the drunks when she had to awaken them so they could go home early in the morning. Slowly, his eyes regained some sort of focus. She didn't stop working on his face until he opened his eyes and spoke. "God damn, that sure in the hell ain't no bunk. Shit, it must be raw dope. That shit can be cut. Baby, you don't know what you got there, do you?" He stared at her foolishly, trying to get his mind right. "Yeah, I know what I got now," Sandra said sharply, her eyes never leaving his face. The possibilities of what she had didn't escape her whatsoever. "You got some more of this?" he inquired, showing that he truly was himself again. "No, all I had was the balloon I gave you. You want to give a little of that back?" Sandra asked quickly. "That wouldn't be right," Eddie replied. "You said I could have the balloon, and I didn't shoot it all because I was trying to save some. Now you want me to give that back to you." He didn't bother to add that if he had shot it all, he'd more than likely have been dead. Eddie knew the dope was raw, uncut dope. The bag he had would bring him close to $200 once he cut it and sold it itself. He decided his best bet was to get away from Sandra as fast as he could. That way, she wouldn't bother about asking for any of the stuff back. Sandra had to hold back a smile as she watched Eddie prepare to leave. He rolled up the rest of the dope, making sure the balloon was folded inside some newspaper so that whatever drug fell out would still be wrapped up inside the newspaper. He almost ran out of the apartment since he was in such a hurry to find out how much of a cut the dope would stand. Sandra knew from his actions she had something good. She took a hot bath and went to bed, waiting patiently for the next day when she'd be in school. She knew just how to get rid of the dope. She had thought about it for the past few months, but never put her plan into action because she hadn't known just what she had. Now that she knew, she didn't waste any time. The next day in school, she searched the corridors until she found the boy she had been looking for, Chink. Chink was a young boy who looked so much like a monkey that the rest of the kids had started calling him Chink. She had started speaking to the bashful young boy months ago. Chink wasn't in any of her classes, but she knew him and knew about him. He was the school's pusher. He was a short, dark-complexioned boy with long, muscular arms. He was strong and was known to be a mean fighter. But when it came to girls, he was scared to death of them. He couldn't look one in the eye. He danced from one foot to the other whenever one talked to him, which was rare because the girls acted like they were afraid of him. When Sandra approached him in the hall, she had a hard time keeping him cornered while she talked to him. "I want to see you after school, man. You hear me, Chink? I want you to wait for me outside the front door." Chink heard her all right, but he couldn't stand still. He wasn't really frightened. He just didn't know how to act around girls. Since he lived with just his father, behind the pool room his father ran, he never was near any women. He liked Sandra. She was one of the few girls, if not the only one, in the whole school who spoke to him every time she saw him. And it didn't seem to make any difference to her who she was with. If she was with other girls, even though it made Chink nervous when she would still go out of her way to speak to him. Now, she wanted him to wait for her outside of school. He knew that he'd do it, but he hated the idea of it, standing out there, where everyone could see him, waiting for a girl. "I'll be looking for you, man," she said, leaving him in the hall. He sighed with relief as she departed, but he was still wondering what she wanted. It couldn't be dope, he told himself, because he knew everybody who used in the school, and she didn't hang out with none of that crowd. His mind was in a turmoil the rest of the day, wondering what was the reason. It didn't bother his schoolwork, though, because he was another one of the practicing illiterate children that filled the ghetto schools. Chink suffered from the same problems that Sandra had. When he was younger, he had a clothes problem, but his main problem was his face. He hated the ridicule so much that he tried to become invisible. He couldn't stand for a teacher to call on him in the classroom, so he pretended to be mentally disturbed. With his looks, it wasn't hard to fool the teachers. Most of the young white school teachers couldn't stand to look upon his features without shivering anyway. And he knew this, could sense this. As soon as one of them turned away from him, shaking, he knew what the reason was. He couldn't change himself to please them, so he tried to make himself invisible. The day passed slowly for Sandra. She constantly watched the clock on the wall of her homeroom. At 10 minutes to 3, she gathered her books together. She didn't want anything to slow her down. At 2 minutes to 3, she got up and moved to an empty desk near the door. When the bell rang, she was the first one out of the homeroom. She raced towards the front door. She had just about reached it when she saw Chink coming from the opposite direction. She stopped and waited for him. Chink was in such a hurry that he didn't notice her in the bunch of children rushing for the door. He went out the door and then stopped and stood around, not knowing what to do. He felt like everyone was watching him. He would have bolted and run, but his curiosity and his humble respect for Sandra wouldn't allow him to take such a cowardly way out. He saw her as soon as she came out the door and glanced the other way. "Hey, big man," she said lightly as she came up. "What you trying to do, ignore me?" She was only joking with him, but her words started him to shifting from one foot to the other. Chink glanced at her, then looked away. He couldn't stand to look her in the eyes. "What's wrong, boy?" she said, still joking with him. "'Cause you got on them sharp-ass threads, you think you big shit, huh?" Now she had him. Chink dressed above average. His clothes cost more than any other kids could afford. He dressed sharp every day, but he didn't want to be reminded of it. Her direct attack embarrassed him, and he blushed down to his shoes. His constant movement gave Sandra a feeling of being a complete woman. She knew he was embarrassed by being near her. It was a new experience for her. The total power of a woman over a man. She enjoyed the feeling. When some friends passed and yelled out at them, she enjoyed his embarrassment. She took his arm and wrapped hers around it. "You're gonna walk me to work," she stated. She felt his muscular arm tighten up under her fingers, but he followed her on down the street. He kept his head down and shuffled along beside her. When one of the addicts came up and spoke to him, he didn't know how to handle it. With Sandra beside him, she handled it for him. "Go on, man, and take care of your business. I'll be waiting right here." She stopped and leaned against a rotting fence. Chink walked off a few feet, removed a small balloon, and gave it to the young drug addict. Sandra watched as money was exchanged between them. When Chink returned, she gave him a big smile, revealing beautiful white, evenly spaced teeth. "Don't worry, man. That's what I wanted to talk to you about," she said lightly. Chink stopped in his tracks. He wasn't going to start her off on drugs, no matter how much she begged. He really liked and respected Sandra. He remembered when she used to come to school as raggedy as he was, and he knew that her mother hadn't bought the nice clothes she wore. He respected her for being able to go out into the streets and get what she wanted, but he wasn't about to make a drug addict out of her. "If it's drugs you want, gal, I ain't about to sell you none," he stated point blank. For the first time, he glanced up and looked directly in her eyes. "I mean it, Sandra." "Well, I'll be damned," Sandra replied, surprised. "But it ain't no drugs that I want to buy. I want you to sell some drugs for me," she stated as she took his arm and started him down the street. Now it was Chink's turn to be surprised. He stared at her with his mouth open, unable to speak. "Boy, if you don't close your mouth," she said lightly, "you're gonna end up catching a mouthful of flies." She laughed, then removed the balloon from her new bra and gave it to him. "I don't know how many times you can cut it. All I know is it can be cut, Chink. I done already had an addict test it, and he almost fell out 'cause it was too strong." They walked along in silence with Chink carrying the dope. He finally asked, "Where did the dope come from?" By the time they reached the store where Sandra worked, she explained everything to Chink, even to how much dope she had hidden. For some reason, she believed she could be honest with him. She took him on as a partner. They shook hands outside the store. Then Chink went on his way to find out just how much cut the dope could stand. The next morning before going to school, Sandra dressed carefully in an expensive pants outfit she had stolen over the weekend. It was a form-fitting outfit, black, with a white blouse and black silk jacket. The price tag had been $120. When she had inquired about it, the sales girl had almost laughed in her face, knowing that the skinny black girl in front of her couldn't afford the expensive outfit. She had made a big joke out of it, displaying it as if she knew she had a sale, until Sandra made up her mind to steal the outfit just to teach the girl a lesson. Sandra knew she couldn't go back into the store again, since the girl had more than likely missed the outfit as soon as Sandra had left. Sandra glanced in her cracked mirror at herself, and she liked what she saw. She quickly gathered up her books and left the apartment, not knowing if her mother had come in or not. As soon as she came out of the apartment building, she found Chink waiting on her. "Hi, honey," she said sweetly, causing him to drop his head and blush. She examined him while his head was down. He was wearing a pair of gray pants with a matching leather jacket. The clothes, being expensive, covered his muscular body to perfection. He took her books from her. That stuff was sure enough smoking, Sandra. It knocked them junkies to their knees, he said, and held out a roll of money. She slowly counted the roll of money. "It's over $200 here," she said, surprised. "You ain't take your share out of it yet, have you?" "Oh, nah, Sandra, I can wait till next time before I takes out mine," he said, speaking flatly with his head down. Sandra counted the money again, then split it in half. "Here, I told you yesterday that we was going to cut the money in half," she said as she pushed his share into his hand. Then, as he took the money, she reached over and lifted up his chin. "Listen, Chink, when you talk to me, don't give me that shuffling shit you use in school. And quit speaking like you just came from Georgia or Mississippi, boy. You ain't country, so stop acting like it, man. Be a man. I don't like boys," she stated coldly. As they continued on toward school, he lifted his head up and took pride in the fact that he was walking next to the best-dressed girl in school. He noticed the large, mannish-looking hat she wore. It made her look like a boy, but the black outfit she wore was all female. Every line of her slim body was shown to his best advantage, and he gloried in the fact that he was walking beside this young, fine, brown frame. When they passed other kids and the kids yelled out at them, he found himself walking in a more caddish manner. Sandra noticed a change in him, but remained silent. For some reason, she found herself drawn to the husky boy next to her. There was nothing handsome about him, but he wasn't as ugly as the silly girls in school liked to pretend he was. His long arms were loaded with muscle, and when she looked in his eyes, she found him to be bright and alert with a smoldering intelligence that he couldn't hide. From that day on, they walked to school and came home together. Some days, she'd lead him over to the library. At first, he had rebelled until she picked out certain books and made him promise her that he'd take them home and read them. And once she started him reading, he was addicted. He sometimes took her arm and led her over to the library, where he'd wait patiently until she picked out some books for him. The summer passed swiftly for them until all of her dope was gone. And in its place, she had a bank account that was over $3,000. She made Chink start an account, and together they put up some money, and Chink bought some dope and continued to sell it for the both of them. One evening, after she got paid, she left the store. As soon as she started to walk up the street, she noticed a car pull up beside her. "Hey, baby, how about a ride?" She glanced over and saw Eddie. "No, honey, that's all right. I'm expecting somebody to pick me up," she said, speaking the truth. Chink had just bought an old car, and she had been looking for him out the window of the store. She figured he must have got held up and decided to walk on home. "Come on, honey," Eddie said, his voice shaking slightly. For the first time, she really took notice of him. His nose was running and his eyes were watery. She knew at once that he was sick, but it didn't bring any pity out of her. Over the months, she had counted up how much money she had given to him, and it was over $100. So she had decided that that must come to a stop. So it wasn't her problem trying to help him keep up his habit. He parked the car and came around the front of it. "Here, girl, what's with this funny shit? You act like I did something to you," he exclaimed loudly. "It ain't that, Eddie. It's just that I ain't got no money to give you, and I know that's all you want. You don't never stop by until Friday when I get paid, so I don't need you, man," she stated coldly, looking him in the eye. For a minute, he was surprised. Then anger took over. He had depended on her to get his fix money, and now the silly young bitch was coming down on him. He grabbed at her, only to find a switchblade knife descending on his arm, and he just barely snatched his arm back in time. Now, he was really mad. "Fool-ass young bitch," he snarled angrily. "You damn near cut me," he said. "If you put your hands on me, I am going to cut you," she answered him honestly. Before the words were out of her mouth, his hand flashed out and he slapped her viciously across the face. His hand was a blur as he slapped her again. Then, when she attempted to bring up the knife, he knocked it from her hand. He stepped in close and slapped her viciously again until her head rocked on her shoulders. She tried to scratch him, but he was too swift for her. Tears of anger flowed down her cheeks as she tried to fight him back. When he demanded the money, she cursed him harshly. He slapped her again. Suddenly, he was gone, and she fought back the tears so that she could see. Chink had him by the back of his neck, then spun him around and smashed a huge fist into Eddie's face again and again. The fight was as lopsided as her effort had been against Eddie. Eddie didn't stand a chance. Sandra had never seen Chink angry, and now she hoped she never would again. He moved with the swiftness of a hunting cat. His strength was that of a bull, and his anger was that of a man that has found himself loving something and then seen someone trying to destroy it. Chink couldn't have explained to himself the rage that overcame him when he drove up and saw Eddie slapping Sandra around. This slim girl was the only thing he cared for in the whole motherfucking world, and he had known in that minute he'd die before he'd allow anyone to harm her. He had burst from his car like a mad bull, goaded beyond any thought but to kill that which offended him. As Eddie slumped to his feet, Sandra grabbed one of Chink's arms and tried to drag him away from the bloody bundle that lay pouring blood at his feet. But Chink's arm was like a band of steel. Her small strength was nothing, and he didn't even feel her pulling on him. It took 4 men who had come up to watch the fight to get him off Eddie, and they had a job of holding the young boy back from killing the older one on the ground. "Chink! Chink!" she screamed and threw herself into his arms, fixing her small body against his so that he couldn't help but notice who it was. Sandra was as tall as Chink, but that was where the comparison ended. For a brief minute, he almost tossed her away from him, but she clung to him. Her arms were locked around his muscular neck, and as he rocked his wide body back and forth, she was swung almost off her feet. But she held tightly. He was like an enraged grizzly bear, but somehow she managed to get him back to his car. "We got to leave, baby," she said over and over again. "The police will be here in a minute, and we don't need that." She pushed him into the car and ran around and jumped in the other side and started the motor. He had been giving her driving lessons in the evenings, so she could handle a car quite well. Sandra drove over to her house and took him upstairs with her. She led him into her bedroom as if he was a child. And as they sat down on the edge of the bed, his huge frame shook from the passion that he had just been filled with. Sandra leaned over and kissed him tenderly. His arms encircled her until she believed she was held in a vice. He kissed her slowly, tenderly at first. Then she returned his kisses until they found themselves making love. It was the first time for her, and she cried out. But he was so tender that she stretched to meet his every move until they were as one. They made love the rest of the evening and through the early morning until Sandra heard her mother come in drunk. She didn't bother to get up, and neither did he. She lay in his arms until the sharp lights from her door opening caused them both to roll out of the bed. "Whore! No good bitch!" her mother screamed at her drunkenly from the doorway. She yelled for her boyfriend to come in. "Take that punk out of here," she ordered as her companion came into the bedroom behind her. By the time Sandra had quickly dressed, "He ain't throwing nobody out," Sandra said quietly. "I paid the motherfucking rent on this place for the past 3 months now, so ain't no motherfucker, ain't nobody that I like gonna get tossed the fuck out. Bitch, you ain't but 15 years old. You don't order nobody around here. I says who's gonna come in and who's not, her mother replied. She stepped forward to slap Sandra, but found herself staring at the switchblade knife her daughter held. Ain't gonna be no slaps either, Sandra stated harshly, 'cause if you put your drunken hands on me, I'll cut your goddamn throat. Her mother stared at her speechless. She didn't know what to say, but she wasn't drunk enough to run up against the knife her daughter held. I'm gonna call the police and have this nigga here put in jail for rape, she finally managed to say. I'll fix his little red wagon first. Then I'll have your ass put in juvenile until you get some sense. And if you do, Sandra stated coldly, there won't be nobody to pay your rent for you. Her words stopped her mother in her tracks. She had become too accustomed to having her daughter pay the rent. Chink removed a large bankroll from his pocket and tossed $80 on the bed. There's this month's or the next month's rent. I'll stop by and pay you rent each month, but Sandra is moving out of this flat. If you want the money, it's yours. If you want to go to the police, it's up to you, but you won't get a penny if you do. Greed flashed across the mother's face. Her eyes went to the money on the bed, then back to the young couple. Well now, she said, changing her tone, Sandra's old enough to do what she wants, but these white folks don't think so. If y'all get into any trouble, I'm just gonna say I don't know nothing about it. That's all. Don't come begging me to stick my neck out if something happens, and I expect you to bring me that rent money on the first of every month, 'cause I needs it. She picked up the money, then added, this is just enough for me to catch up on my back rent, so I'll be expecting some more on the first. She glanced at her daughter, then dropped her eyes because both of them knew it was a lie. Sandra didn't have any suitcases, so she put her clothes in brown shopping bags. Chink helped her carry everything to the car. He was so happy he couldn't believe it was really happening. Sandra was just as surprised. It had all happened so sudden. At 3 o'clock in the morning, she found herself moving out on her own. But for some reason, with Chink beside her, she wasn't frightened of the move. It seemed as if it was all to the better. They checked into a motel for the rest of the morning, and the next day, Chink went out and found a dope fiend couple who rented an apartment for them. Chink paid 3 months in advance on a modern apartment on the west side of Los Angeles. Since they had the car, they didn't have any problem getting back and forth to school. Since he was 16, Chink wanted to quit school, but Sandra raised so much hell about it, he decided to stay on, and their days in high school passed quickly. As time wore on, each became more dependent on the other. For Chink, Sandra was his world. Everything he did was for her, and she felt the same way. She went out of her way to cook good dinners for him. Once she found out what he liked, she'd spend hours in the kitchen getting it right for him. He had stopped her from stealing from the stores, and now he bought all her clothes. He still sold dope every day, and his income was fairly large for a young couple. He bought a later model car, which was the beginning of the end. It drew attention to the young couple when they went to school. Now the teachers even whispered about them as they passed in the hallways together. They were too well dressed, and when they went to the lunchroom, they bought whatever they wanted without concerning themselves about the cost. The other kids talked, and soon everybody in the school knew that they lived together. Spring had just begun. They had passed the winter together with no problems, and now that Sandra was 16, they didn't think they had anything to worry about. Chink stopped Sandra on the way to the lunchroom. I got to run home for a minute, baby, and pick up some more stuff. You want to ride with me or go ahead and eat? He asked her during their lunch break. Nah, honey, I'm starving. I think I'll go ahead and eat. I'll see you when you get back, she answered quietly, then smiled at him. She couldn't have realized that it would be quite a while before they would meet again. Chink had only a half hour, so he left in a hurry. On the way back from the apartment, he had a flat tire, so he left the car and caught a cab. And as soon as the cab pulled up and he got out, detectives seemed to come out of the ground. He tried to swallow the dope, but he had too many balloons on him. The school kids sitting by the windows saw it all. Chink went down under a flood of white and black detectives as they tried to reach him before he could swallow the stuff. He fought back, striking out with his huge arms. He broke a white detective's nose, and blood gushed out as he screamed in pain with his nose leaking. Another officer took his place and went down just as quickly. "Pin his arms!" someone yelled as the men scrambled around trying to hold tight the struggling boy. One detective pulled his gun. "Step away from the black bastard!" he roared loudly, pointing his gun at the struggling group. By this time, the fighting group of men was surrounded by kids that had run out of classrooms to see the fight. "Don't shoot him, you no-good bastards!" one of the braver kids yelled. "You got 10 men. Ain't that enough to take one little black boy?" And indeed, it was enough. Now the detectives put their billy clubs to work, and Chink went down to stay with his head bloody. The men rolled him over on his back and handcuffed him roughly. "That's one black bastard, that's a bull," one of the white detectives said, giving a compliment but still stepping on the toes of the black officers who were beside him. "What about the girl?" one of the detectives asked. "She's probably still in school," a black officer answered. "We can walk in and pick her up now," he said, and started off, followed by 3 white detectives. When the school bell rang, Sandra left her class, not aware of what had happened outside the school. When she passed 2 white men in the long hallway, she took them to be school teachers. If she had bothered to glance behind her, she would have seen the men turn and start to follow her. She stopped at her locker and put her books up. Before she could close it, a black hand reached over and held it open. "What's the idea, man?" she asked, without bothering to glance up to see who it was. "We want to see what you have in your locker," the man asked. This time, she did glance up. Her senses reeled and spelled out police as she noticed the well-dressed black man leaning over her shoulder. Her glance quickly took in the white man next to him. Then she turned and saw the other one. "Damn, man," she exclaimed, fighting for time. She didn't have anything in her locker, but she hesitated anyway, trying to figure out what was happening. Her slight hesitation made the officers think she had something to hide. One of them shoved her roughly out of the way. She struck her back on the handle and cursed loudly. "You white bastard!" she swore. They tossed everything out of her locker and went through it until they knew there was nothing in there to conceal. "Well, what now?" one of them asked. "Well, we know she's in it up to her neck with him, so take her down too," another one ordered. And as they let her out of the school, the teachers stood around helplessly and watched. Not one asked what the problem was. The rough handling of the girl meant nothing to them as long as they weren't involved. The black teachers who watched shook in their shoes because they knew what the white police thought of all of them. They could and would be handled the same way if they so much as opened their mouths. As the police passed, they each gave them a wide smile, as if they had just arrested some notorious criminal instead of a 16-year-old girl. They led Sandra out to the police car, and when they saw Chink in the back seat handcuffed and bleeding, her heart turned to stone. One of the officers spoke to her. "Isn't this your boyfriend?" he asked harshly, trying to make his voice as cold as possible so that he would frighten her. But instead of frightening her, it only made her grit her teeth in anger. The sight of Chink had been enough. Now, the detective's voice on top of it filled her with unreasoning anger. If his voice had been harsh, hers was chilling when she deemed to answer. "If you mean honky, do I give some pussy every now and then? That's our business. Ain't got nothing to do with no Peckerwood." The young white detective was shocked, and his face showed it. One of the other white officers stepped up, thinking that he had to protect their image in front of the school kids who stood around. He couldn't allow no black kid to talk to them in that manner in front of such a large group of people. One of the black detectives had to fight back a smile. He had known it was coming. He could tell from the shock in her eyes when she saw her boyfriend in the car. He realized she was angry and would say just about whatever came into her mind, and damn the consequences. "You're a smart black bitch, ain't you?" the older officer said as he stepped up and slapped her. The only mistake he made was slapping her instead of using his fist, because the slap didn't even turn her head. She brought her knee up so fast he didn't even realize it was coming until pain exploded in his nuts and he folded up like a used bag, crying out in pain. Now, all of the hours Chink had spent teaching her how to protect herself came into use. She moved coldly, as if she was standing outside herself. She didn't think she could win, but she could hurt this one white bastard in front of her. She moved so fast, she took the officers by surprise. Knocking his hat from his head, she grabbed a handful of hair and pulled his head towards her knee. She caught him in the middle of the face with a brutal, powerful blow that splattered blood over both of them. His head shot back as if his neck had broken, and before they could reach her, she kicked him in the face again, breaking his nose. They moved on her then, coming from all sides. Chink, watching from the back seat of the police car, cried out in his helplessness. To the white officers who rushed at her, she was not a young black girl anymore, a schoolgirl at that. She was just someone black who had found the nerve to strike back at them. They couldn't tolerate it, and they rushed her with billy clubs, striking each other in their hurry to strike her. She went under them, holding her head for protection until one well-placed blow put her to sleep. Then she didn't feel the other blows that rained down on her prone body. Chink, in his blind rage, with his hands cuffed behind his back, tried to butt his way out of the car until one of the uniformed cops in the car caught him behind the ear with his club. As Chink sank down on the floor of the car, the cop spoke to his partner. "I know how the poor bastard must feel. If it was my old lady out there, I'd want to kill the whole motherfucking bunch of them." Okay. "She's out!" one of the black detectives yelled and pushed white detectives out of the way. The murmurings from the crowd of school kids brought them back to their senses, and to avoid a riot, they controlled themselves. As the detectives tossed her unconscious body into the car beside Chink, one of the white detectives muttered, "They ain't no better than a couple of damn animals the way they act." "No better," one of his friends commented. "That's all the fuck they are, is animals." The black officer who had been responsible for the arrest glanced at the two white officers who were speaking. He noticed the $39 washable suits both men wore, then glanced into the car at Chink, who wore $50 pants and a pair of alligator shoes that must have cost $100. For the first time, he was ashamed that he was responsible for the arrest of the young couple. He knew just about everything there was to know about them. He wondered idly if the white cops who called them animals could have come from such hardships as children and survived as well as this young couple had. No. He doubted very seriously if either one would have been able to pull himself up out of the ghetto as they had been trying to do. We have reached the ending to this part of the mini-series on Ralph Reads. I would like to thank you, queens and kings, fellow royalty, for stopping by. You can connect with me via Twitter and Instagram, as well as Periscope at RGMC2407. If you would like to leave a small donation, you may do so at paypal.me/RGMC2407 or the Cash App. My cash tag is RGMC2407, or the Zelle app. My Zelle and email is rgmc2407@gmail.com. You may also find me on my very own channel, RGMC, Ralph Garcia, Master of Ceremonies, as well as right here at home on the United Ronin Networks. We are Ronin. Fellow royalty, pick up a good book, read a good story, and set your good self free. I appreciate you and love you like cooked food. I will see you folks on the next edition of Ralph Reads. Au revoir.